how did Rick Lenz, the actor, become Rick Lenz, the writer?
Ah, well, I was when I got out of college, University of Michigan, a long time ago. I got a job very unexpectedly directing a civic theater in my hometown, which was Jackson, Michigan, and so I directed 12 plays, including The Crucible and Blithe Spirit and some wonderful Look Homeward Angel, some good plays in those years. But I also got a little bit. I've always had the desire to create, and I wanted to write a play. So I started to work on something. They wouldn't let me do it. But it got me started writing plays. And my first plays were always, the most simplistic kind of things. They were, boy meets girl. Hello, how are you doing? I'm fine. Where are you? All that stuff. And so I just kept doing it. And by my late 20s, I had a play produced off Broadway, and then another one, and then I had one done on PBS over here and on this side of the pond, and that was the beginning. And then finally, playwriting is a kind of it's a tough market to stay open in, especially if I'm, as I was, conducting an acting career or trying to. And so I began to consider writing novels instead. And I began with a memoir, and I always had been writing notes and so on. I'm going on way too long here. But anyway, that was kind of the gist of it. I started to write novels eventually, and that was it. And I just grew to love it. And when I stopped working as much as an actor, and I didn't like the way I used to, the kind of work I was getting, I decided that the full-time writing thing was just as satisfying at that point, and so that's what I did.
Why not? Yeah. Now I've seen on your website, it's not just acting, it's not just writing, but you also seem to be a very accomplished painter.
Oh, thanks.
So does all this come sort of very naturally to you, I suppose?
Well, I don't know. I was one of those kids who was told when he was in school. He says, "You can't draw. You're not an artist." And so I believed them. And then I would do little drawings and stuff. And my wife Linda said, "I like those." And she said, "Why don't you do some more?" And so I did, and I kept on doing it. So that's become a thing of mine. I'm not really certainly not a draftsman, but I do like just kind of diving in the way you do in any kind of free creative process and just attacking it. And sometimes it turns out well. So.
Oh, good. And obviously, as you've mentioned, you've written several novels, all of which have been very well received. And the newest book came out at the start of the year, A Town Called Why. So can you sort of tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. That was the first novel that I wrote, or the book that I tried that didn't have Hollywood as a background. It was I guess the genre was mystery, suspense, fiction. Took place in Arizona. I've always been fascinated by the desert, and so using that as a background, I just created a detective story and with a Native American background. And I've always been fascinated by the way we in this country have treated the indigenous peoples not fascinated, that's the wrong word. I've been horrified, and as a lot of people have been and should be. Anyway, that formed the background, and so my lead detective is a half Apache, half regular American white guy detective. Yeah.
And what is the sort of the writing process like for you? Is it a lengthy process?
Yeah, it ends up being. It used to be that I would write some plays in a matter of days. You can't do that with a novel. So it was. I found that the first novel I wrote, or the first novel that I had some success with, which was The Alexandrite, I wrote, I would print out the pages that I'd written that day and put them on, a desk off in the corner somewhere, and I would watch the pages pile, and I just tried to take pleasure in that. And then after a while, I had a pile of pages, so I learned to be a little bit patient, which is not my nature really, but you have to be to write a novel. So.
No, I admire people like yourself that sort of do write books and screenplays and what have you, because I think I would get too distracted. I think, you know,
Yeah, well, I
yeah,
think I would have at your age, perhaps too. But I have a little more patience now, perhaps. I'm not sure.
sure. And obviously, you mentioned that a town called Y sort of is set in Arizona.
Uh-huh.
It has a bit of a kind of Western setting, I suppose.
Yes.
Obviously, that's a genre that you've appeared in both on television and film. Is it sort of a go-to genre for you?
Not really. I don't think. I mean, I'd never written one before, and it's my first time in the novel I'm beginning now. Just in the first stages of it is again one that has a time slip thing to it, and it's also got a Hollywood background, which is more what I'm familiar with, or a show business background. I was in New York for 10 years before I came out here. So yeah, it's so that to answer your question or get close to it, I hope. No, it was not anything that was instinctively something that I took to. It just kind of came out, just the way stories do from your own mind, and you can be interested in several things. And that's my excuse my voice. I'm having a little hoarseness problem just today, but it'll go away.
No, no, you're absolutely fine. Um, I suppose with all the novels that you've done, and like you say, sort of you're writing another one, does it become addictive, I suppose?
Yeah, yeah, it sure
Yeah,
does. Yeah,
yeah.
it's I'm kind of caught. I was caught at some point between going back and forth between the art and the writing, and I have to tell you that basically the writing is the thing that gets in there and digs its hooks in and grabs my brain and my spirit and says, let's go with this. So yeah, that is addictive to me.
And obviously, we touched on the Western genre just then, and certainly one of my favorite films, The Shootist. It's an incredible film, all-star cast, and of course notable for being the final film of John Wayne. What are your memories of sort of making that film?
Well, I'd heard some things. Well, some of them in retrospect, I guess. I had heard that Wayne was sick and was having trouble, health wise. Excuse me. But he was okay. He had been in the hospital for I guess a couple of weeks during the time that I was on the film, and but he was fine, and he was not. And they'd said also that there was a contretemps between Don Siegel, the director, and John Wayne, but it didn't. It wasn't that wasn't happening when I was shooting during the two weeks I was on the film. And then I finished my major sequence with Duke, and they called me back to do another scene because I forget the exact reason, but there were some things that were not going to be in the film that had originally been planned. So I had another sequence with Harry Morgan in that film. So when I saw him again the first time, I should tell you that John Wayne, at the end of that sequence where he kicks me out the door, and he pushes my head down with a pistol in his hand, which he had in my mouth, which was a funny thing to play because I was mostly concentrating on not getting my teeth broken. And he pushed my head down and then kicked me down the front stairs where my stuntman and my stunt double. And when I saw him 2 weeks later for that next sequence I was talking about, he said, I only ever did that once before. And so he was kind of apologizing in his way. He was very, he asked me my politics at one point, and my politics was not exactly what his politics was. But I said, well, I don't really have politics. I didn't want to get into a discussion of any kind like that with him, and he just kind of shrugged and smiled, and so he knew. And I've a couple of times in my life thought of been in the position of thinking I wanted to defend John Wayne because he said a couple of awful things along the way. Even quoted as saying, and he was really kind of a, I thought, at least in person, a decent guy. And he had a lot of liberal friends, Paul Newman and who was the cinematographer? I can't think. Anyway, he was, he listened to the other side. I don't know why I'm talking about this, except it's just on my mind because of the political atmosphere, that's taking place now.
No, of course.
Yeah.
And was there a feeling making The Shootist that it would be John Wayne's final film, or did that not come up at all?
Well, he was very sick and he had had cancer, and there was a rumor that he had it again. So I think everybody knew that it might very well be his last film, particularly considering the fact that he was, they had to shut down for 2 weeks because of him, and they shot doubles. In fact, he said to me at one time, they had a double playing John Books, yeah, and I said, "Oh."
And obviously, you mentioned the fact that in your scene with John Wayne, he sort of gave you a clip, and
Yeah,
maybe you felt more of it than you should have done. Am I right in saying as a result of that, you sort of had to go to the hospital and get a few stitches? Is that right?
yeah, I did.
Yeah.
I went to the hospital and got 2 stitches, and no big deal. And the next time, that's when he said what I told you he told me, and it was a fun experience for me. I guess it was a little bit a lot of things for everybody else, but it was I had a good time. So
Mm.
yeah, fun.
And of course, so you already mentioned it, but going on from that, he sort of in the scene did give you a kick up the backside, or your stunt double kick up the backside. But I think that
Right.
itself would be a claim to fame. So
Yeah, yeah. I think that the memory of that, they once did an Academy Awards, and I saw it was the year of Brokeback Mountain, and there were a lot of homoerotic kind of scenes from westerns. It's kind of a comedic, comment in the awards show, and I was watching the show at home. I was not at the awards, and they showed a picture of the gun in the mouth and that was me. And so I didn't think, oh, how embarrassing to have that gun in my mouth. And I thought, terrific. I'm showing to however many hundreds of millions of people around the world. I liked that.
and of course, the scene you have with Wayne at the end there, sort of Lauren Bacall comes in and briefly makes an appearance.
Right.
So, sort of any memories of that? What was she like?
Well, I'd worked with her before on Broadway in Cactus Flower, which I then did the movie a couple of years later, and so I was always a little afraid of Ms. Bacall. We always called her Ms. Bacall because you had to, and I was originally the understudy on Broadway in that role that I eventually did the movie version of, and so I would go. My job was along with a couple of very small parts that I played in the show, was I would go knock on her door one time, and then I had a flashlight, and I would light her way to her entrance as if she couldn't see, which she could. And it was a silly job, but I did it and was happy for it. And then later on, it was because of her basically that I got the role. She liked me, and I replaced a young actor named Burt Brinkerhoff, who had originated my role on Broadway. And then I was lucky enough to get the movie, and that's how I knew Ms. Bacall.
And of course, the other scene you have in The Shootist, as Dobkins sort of comes towards the end of the film, with a Western legend in his own right, in Harry Morgan.
Oh yeah, well, I also did a television series with Harry. I did another Western, a contemporary Western for Disney with Harry called Scandalous John. and it didn't do very well. But it was I like it. I still like the movie, and um, it's he was a lovely man, a very funny guy. I, I remember one time he told me a story. If you're interested, he told me a story. He was on the television series Dragnet for a while with uh, Jack Webb, and Jack Webb was a kind of a he was as clipped in his way of dealing with the world as he was in the role of Joe Friday on that series. And one morning as they were shooting, Harry told me he made a wisecrack. Harry was always making, not that often, but they were always good ones, and he always got a great laugh because he was a funny guy, and as well as a really fine character actor. And anyway, he made some kind of little joke one morning while they were shooting Dragnet, and then later on, almost before they were wrapping up, they were a little behind, and Jack Webb was directing, and things were not going exactly right, and he was just going, flipping through the scenes that he was trying to get through. And at one point, he got frustrated and said, "Harry, if you'd stop wisecracking all the time." And Harry said, "That was 8 hours ago, Jack." So that's typical Harry Morgan moment.
Sure. And of course, Richard Boone appears in the film, his third collaboration with John Wayne. But of course, you worked with Boone in Heck Ramsey.
Yes.
So what was it? What was he like? Do you sort of have much interaction with him? I suppose you must have known him a little bit.
Oh, I did. Yeah, because we were the kind of the two. Well, he dominated it all. In fact, he tried to get me fired after the first year, and because I don't know why, but there, some ego stuff, I think, and then NBC said no, you can't, and the series won't go on. Actually, at that point, that was nice to be wanted that much. But anyway, we became friends after that once he realized I was a fait accompli for that series, and that's not exactly what I'm looking for, but you know what I mean, I think. And so, yeah, we did become friends. We even talked about doing a play on Broadway together, an O'Neill play, but that didn't work out. And Dick had a problem with a little problem with the bottle, and I think it wore him down, and like a lot of actors did in those days, and it's depleting, and I would. It was just, and he was so good when he was great. He was just really he was bigger than the medium. And yet it worked. I remember one time he had a show where his lady love had died, and he gets drunk, and he wakes up the next morning and remembers it, and he's lying in bed, and he just woke up with just a Greek tragedy kind of groan, and it was really just, it's just chilling, and far bigger than the medium. But it worked because he was Richard Boone, and he was incredible. He was really a dominant actor when he was on. He was wonderful.
And I feel bad because I just keep name dropping people, but obviously you mentioned him earlier, Don Siegel, who directed the film.
Yeah.
I suppose notable for sort of his work with Clint Eastwood and the films they did.
Yeah.
But again, what was it like working with him? Because I suppose that must have been quite special. Obviously, a notable director.
Yeah. Well, I got to tell you that I basically worked only that one scene with John Wayne. That was really the central point of my character. I was on alone before Duke shows up, and so I didn't really have that much. Don didn't say that much to me. He had cast me. I didn't read for it. He just cast me. I don't know, from maybe what I'd done before. I'm not sure, maybe because of the shoot of Heck Ramsey, which I'd done at that point. But anyway, so he was pleased with what I did, and I guess Duke was too. So there was not much said at that point. I think perhaps Duke and Siegel were at kind of not an impasse, but a temporary, at least a truce during that time in terms of their feelings about each other. And the scene worked from the beginning, I think. And so I didn't really have that much to do. He was very appreciative. He told me, he sent me a nice note thanking me for what I did. And I, of course, sent him one thanking him for the job. And so that was really kind of all I had to do with Mr. Siegel. He was a nice man. I liked him.
Mm. And I think I saw online that you noted in a previous interview that James Stewart was sort of one of your acting heroes, inspirations. And of course, he sort of appears briefly in the film as well. Did you have a chance to sort of meet him, or?
I just chatted with him briefly. He wasn't even in my scene. I showed up one day when he and Duke were shooting, and so I just said, my life has been kind of influenced by the fact that about half the critics at that point in my career, made references to Jimmy Stewart when I was very young. They said young Jimmy Stewart, which I guess, which you like to a point because I admire Jimmy Stewart, but it's really not a good thing for an actor to be that much compared to somebody else. So I had a nice chat with him. He said, "Don't worry about that. Just do what you do." And he kind of gave me that advice. And so it was pleasant, but kind of brief.
No, I mean, I love the film, so those stories are something else for me, really. I think finally for me, and I think perhaps I already know the answer to this, but obviously A Town Called Why is fairly recently released.
Right.
But are there any plans for any more? And you said you're sort of writing another novel, but sort of what's next for Rick Lenz, I suppose?
The next thing for me, knocking on wood, is a kind of a revisiting of my previous novel, which was called Hello, Rest of My Life, which is about an actor who goes back in time to 1974 in the case of that first book, and gets a chance to do it again. But by that time, before he went back, he's involved in a really good marriage. And if you can see back, oh no, you can't really. My wife is out there behind me on the porch out there. But I've had a very lovely marriage, and so he gets back in time, this character, and he finds that he gets a chance to do it better this time. The only problem is that he misses his wife in the future, and this is all fictional, of course. And he gets so he decides to try to get back to where he came from, and that's pretty much the pattern of that book. And now I want to, because it seemed to work out very well, I want to do a repeat of that book and have him go back again for various other reasons. And so it's a lot of fun. It's one of those things that I just sit down to every day wondering what's going to happen, and that's a joy for me. So